Hi, this is Matthew from ELREC from the Communities for Conservation project. Welcome to the first video of our environmental podcast series on climate change in the environment. Today we're here with Professor Dave Reay from the University of Edinburgh.
So hello everybody, my name is Jenny. I'm here today with Professor Dave Reay, who is a professor at the University of Edinburgh and the program director of the carbon management course, and we're going to have a talk about climate change today. So the first question would be, who or what is responsible for the greenhouse gases in the UK? Who are the main emitters?
Okay, so the main emitter in the UK would be fossil fuel burning. In terms of responsibility for it, I guess that's all of us. So fossil fuel is burnt for energy, and that includes the electricity we use in our homes, the gas we use for cooking, the petrol and diesel we put in our cars. So that would be the primary source of greenhouse gases.
Mm-hmm. Right, so the mainstream media focuses a lot on carbon dioxide as the most harmful greenhouse gas. What about other greenhouse gases such as methane or nitrogen?
Yeah, they're really important, and they often do get forgotten, probably because they're not as important as carbon dioxide in terms of the amount of warming. So carbon dioxide emissions are so big. These other greenhouse gases, their emissions are smaller, but what makes them really important is they're really powerful greenhouse gases. Mm-hmm. So if we take methane, for instance, if we emit a tonne of that, and a lot of that comes from belching cattle, mm-hmm. so cows and sheep as well, a tonne of that has the warming effect equivalent to 25 tonnes of carbon dioxide. So even though the amounts are smaller, it has a big warming impact even so. Nitrous oxide is even more powerful, mm-hmm. so about 300 times the power of carbon dioxide per tonne. Mm-hmm. So okay, carbon dioxide is the biggie, but if we're going to tackle climate change and reduce our warming effect on the climate, we need to think about methane and nitrous oxide as well.
Mm-hmm. So the documentary Cowspiracy, which has recently gained a lot of popularity, has provoked heated debates about meat production and consumption and livestock as the leading cause of greenhouse gas emissions. Mm-hmm. So their numbers range between 18 and 51% of greenhouse gas emissions globally that are due to livestock. These figures seem to be contested and obviously dependent on which factors you're counting in and out. But even in the latest IPCC report, there's no clear statement in regards to this controversy. There's just a call for more research. So you as a climate scientist, what can you tell us about the scientific background of these claims? What are the links between animal agriculture and climate change?
Yeah, well, I can tell you in terms of we're always after better data around the world, and emissions reporting is a key thing, and all nations report their emissions on a national basis to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So, all right, we've got some uncertainty, particularly around things like land use change. But for agriculture as a sector, so all food production, direct emissions are about 10% of greenhouse gas emissions globally. Land use change, which you can say a lot of that is due to agriculture in terms of clearing land for cattle, grazing, that kind of thing, that's around 17% of emissions. So if we add them together and say all of it is down to food production, providing food for people, then you end up at maybe 27%, 30%. So that's a lot, definitely a sector or set of sectors we need to address. Fossil fuel emissions, fossil fuel burning is the primary source of greenhouse gas emissions from human activities globally.
So one of the biggest claims in the movie was that it is estimated that 70 up to 91% of Amazon deforestation are due to making room for cattle or for growing food for them. So how can we use land more sustainably and mitigate climate change?
So I suppose the big challenge we've got in terms of addressing land use change and food production and climate change, it's challenging because we've got a growing population. We're looking at having to feed 9 billion people by the middle of the century. And so we need to get really smart with our food production, climate smart. And a lot of that is about what we eat, so what makes up our diet. So if we think about things like our meat consumption, beef being a perfect example, it's not a great thing in terms of climate friendly food and diet, because the cows themselves are big methane emitters. They also contribute to nitrous oxide through their manure and urine. but you need quite a large area to actually grow cattle. So that means you get land use change for clearance. And even if we try and grow them intensively, so you say, okay, I'm going to put loads of cattle in one place and I'm going to give them feed to eat rather than let them graze, there are a lot of emissions associated with growing their feed. So essentially those kind of food types are high emissions. They have a high carbon footprint. So one of the key things we can do and we need to do as a global society is not have a very meat intensive diet as the standard. And this is something where if you look around the world, there are good examples of that already, where you've got India, for example, where obviously beef consumption is very, very low. And aligned to that, you tend to get very much lower emissions per person in terms of what everyone's eating. But it is a massive challenge because we've got this growing population. So for me, the key is going to be more efficient agriculture. So if we've got food and we're producing it, any food we produce has a carbon footprint, some more than others, so meat more than vegetables. The major one for me would be to avoid waste. That if we're growing this food, whether it's a cow in the field or a carrot in our garden, that all of that food gets consumed, it gets to the people who need it, so that, all right, we've had the emissions, but it's been worth it. One of the biggest, I think, things to be worried about in the world is somewhere around 20 up to 30% in some areas of food that's produced never actually gets to the people who need it. It's wasted. And if we can reduce that, then we help to increase food security, but we also help to limit climate change impacts.
Right. So the Cowspiracy movie criticizes that environmental charities do not mention farming in their key campaigns in the United States. And when I checked the leading environmental organizations here in the UK, the emphasis was on fossil fuels and banning fracking. Only one charity engaged with livestock impacts and actually produced a report about it. How could environmental organizations address the environmental impact of animal agriculture, and should they make it a more prevalent issue?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's all relative. So if you look at where most of the emissions come from, it's fossil fuel burning, so you focus on those. I think for agriculture, there's obviously getting the message out there that it's an important source of greenhouse gases, so an important part of the solution too. I suppose the messages around it are starting to get out there. I mean, there have been some really good ones in the media in the UK, so people like Jamie Oliver and Hugh Furling-Whittingstall really pushing for reducing food waste, and that has these really good environmental impacts. I think for the meat-intensive diet or the high emissions diet, one of the key messages there probably is around health as well as the environmental benefits. So there, I guess if you're a charity and you're saying, we'd really like to kind of inform people about the impact of agriculture on the environment and actually change behaviour, the route you might want to take is to make clear what you can do as an individual. A key one would be to eat a bit less meat and to grow maybe some of your own vegetables. Make clear that's good for the environment, but probably a really powerful message for a lot of us, certainly for me personally, is that it's better for me. I'll probably feel better, be healthier if I reduce my meat intake, and then I've got this added benefit that it's better for the climate too.
Yeah. So what about the individual level? I mean, many people often think that they do not compare with the big businesses and the industries, that their contribution doesn't matter, and that they are powerless against the major companies. What would you say to these people?
I'd say to them, what are those big businesses? What are the kind of the big conglomerates and the kind of power stations or food manufacturers? What are they there for? And they're there for us. They're all there to serve us. And so we as individuals, obviously, as a collective, they wouldn't function without us deciding that we want, I guess, a certain type of food or a certain type of service. So we all have a power collectively, clearly, and you see that in terms of the rise of farmers markets. The organic movement's a great example of that, of where they see, essentially that they're going to lose money because they're not giving us what we want. Ugly vegetables is another really good example recently. So we do have real power as individuals, but particularly when we work together to change practices. I think in terms of the message to individuals is that the power is with us. And it so often doesn't feel like it, because you hear about climate change and you think, okay, that's all about the Paris agreements and the world leaders. But all those people were there representing their nations and all of us as individuals, as voters. And actually, in terms of whether we win the fight to avoid dangerous climate change, that's all about what each of us decide to do. So the biggest uncertainty when we look at future climate is not in the science and how much warming we get per amount of greenhouse gas. The biggest uncertainty for our future projections is what we all decide to do, how much we're going to emit. And that comes down to the decisions we make in terms of our travel, what we eat, our how we live our lives.
Right. I mean, when it comes to climate change, there's always this notion of placing responsibility and blaming others. So how can communities and every single individual contribute to lower their own carbon footprint?
So I think for most communities, it's a case of getting together, like communities are good at. So there are some brilliant initiatives here in Edinburgh and across Scotland where you've got communities, often through the Climate Challenge Fund has been a great mechanism for that, in terms of bringing groups together, often to share expertise they've already got. So you might have someone who's thought, oh, actually, the green space in our community, we could do more with that. We could grow more of our own food. And actually, once you get the right people together, then it happens. So that would be a key thing people can do. The other really good thing we've got is democracy. And we are blessed in terms of our parliament with, in my experience, politicians who are really very much aware of the environmental challenge that climate change represents. We've got world-leading legislation in terms of the Climate Change Act Scotland. So we've got really hard emissions targets, and the politicians know they're going to miss those targets if they don't engage us. So us as individuals and communities, talking to them, getting their help is also important.
Okay, so the movie Cowspiracy promotes veganism as the way forward. What are your thoughts about that as a way of tackling climate change?
I mean, I suppose it's a way to cut out the meat side of it. So if we all went vegan, I guess you could argue that would reduce emissions, obviously, from livestock agriculture. There's an issue there, I think, in terms of the right to choose. And if you choose to be vegan, I'm sure that's great, and you can say that's having a lower environmental impact. Personally, I think and I'm talking personally, I've cut down my meat consumption, but I still like a bit of meat. And I think where we're better to go towards, instead of a blanket everyone should be vegan, is give people the awareness, make it clear what the health and environmental benefits are, make sure the agricultural production itself is much more efficient and more climate smart. And if we get those things together, then we can move towards a future where we've got what I would describe as a balanced diet. So you've got some protein intake, in the form of fish, in the form of meat, maybe in terms of mycoprotein or protein substitutes, but put together as an average diet for the average person in the world has a lower climate impact than what we have at the moment. And the big one, cut out the food waste.
Right. So maybe as a final question, if you had the power to change any 3 things in society to make it greener, what would that be?
Okay. So even though I'm not a huge fan of some of the things he did, I'm going to quote Tony Blair with that. So education, education, education. Because I'm biased because that's my job. But I think some of all the really good things which have come from the Paris Agreement right down to me changing my diet at home has come from awareness and education. And I think if we can combine that education, so people knowing what they can do and why, with the ability to do it. So recycling being a perfect example. In my street in West Lothian 10 years ago, people did a bit of recycling, but you tended to put it in your car and take it to the recycling facility at the supermarket. And So there was a willingness to recycle, but really not the facility. And then what the council put in were recycling bins for all the different things and for food as well. And that's become the norm now. So we had the education in terms of recycling is good, resource efficiency is good, but you needed that help in terms of the council, the kind of infrastructure to support what we all wanted to do. And when you get those things together, like we've got with recycling, you get a real success. And I think you can take that across the climate change piece. If you've got the education and the awareness giving the will, and that's facilitated by the politicians, the policymakers, then we hit it.
Mm-hmm. Right. So it's all about the micro and the macro level working together.
As ever, yeah.
Yeah, great. So yeah, thank you very much for taking the time out of your busy schedule and meeting with us.
I enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Thanks for watching the video. Hope you enjoyed that. Thank you very much to Professor Dave Reay as well as Ellie and Jenny for facilitating that one. Make sure you subscribe to the YouTube channel or leave a comment below.